The Super Nintendo, my favorite console. I could go on for hours about how much it means to me, and maybe someday I will. But for now, I'll say some of my fondest memories are being a kid during summer vacation and playing the Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo received overwhelmingly positive reviews and became a global success, emerging as the best-selling console of the 16-bit era, despite launching relatively late and facing tough competition from Sega's Genesis in North America and Europe. The Super Nintendo remained a favorite well into the 32-bit era, selling 49 million units worldwide by the time it was discontinued in 2003. Despite being so popular, not all of its games were spotless. So let's take a look at 10 controversial Super Nintendo games. Knights of the Round released for the Super Nintendo in 1994 and drew controversy for its historical inaccuracies and depictions of violence. The game, based loosely on the Arthurian legend, reimagined King Arthur, Lancelot, and Percival as brawling warriors on a quest to unite Britain, often resorting to brutal combat to defeat enemies. Many critics argue that its portrayal of well-known historical and mythological features in an action-heavy beat-em-up format diminished the integrity of the Arthurian legends. The game's focus on hack-and-slash action, where characters slaughter hordes of enemies, was seen as glorifying violence and reducing complex historical narratives into a simplistic, often brutal experience. This raised questions about the appropriateness of using historical figures as protagonists in what was essentially an arcade-style game. Additionally, Knights of the Round was controversial for the level of violence depicted in the game, especially given its release on a console that was still heavily marketed to children. Though the Super Nintendo had seen other violent titles before, Knights of the Round featured a medieval setting where characters dispatched enemies with swords, axes, and other bladed weapons in a way some parents found too graphic. The glorification of combat and lack of any moral consequences for the characters' actions drew criticism, with some reviewers pointing out that the game trivialized violence by making it the primary means of achieving heroic goals. Despite the controversy, however, the game still managed to find a fan base that appreciated its cooperative gameplay, challenging mechanics, and the thrill of embodying the legendary knights. Shadowrun, released for the Super Nintendo in 1993, garnered controversy due to its dark themes and its mature take on the cyberpunk genre, a stark departure from the family-friendly games that characterized much of the console's library. Set in a dystopian future where technology, magic, and corporate power intertwine, Shadowrun features mature storylines involving assassinations, conspiracies, and dealing with criminal syndicates. The game's gritty tone and emphasis on underworld activities, including scenes involving drug dealers and violent street gangs, left many parents uneasy. The game's bleak setting, filled with moral ambiguity, assassins for hire, and themes of corruption, also raised concerns about whether such content was appropriate for younger audiences. Another point of contention was Shadowrun's portrayal of magic and cybernetics in the context of a criminal underworld, which some found problematic. Its depiction of magic, mixed with futuristic technology in a world overrun by corporate greed and moral decay, resonated deeply with older gamers, but unsettled those who worried about its potential influence on young players. The game's cyberpunk narrative wasn't just a simple adventure. It required players to navigate moral gray areas, often making choices that involved violence or deception. This level of complexity and mature content was uncommon on the Super Nintendo, making Shadowrun both a controversial and pioneering title for the console. Despite the controversy, Shadowrun earned a loyal following for its intricate storytelling, detailed world-building, and an innovative take on RPG mechanics, securing its place as a cult classic in the retro gaming community.
Lethal Enforcers.
Lethal Enforcers, released for the Super Nintendo in 1994, and was a lightning rod for controversy. primarily due to its graphic depiction of gun violence and its use of a light gun controller. As a first-person shooter, Lethal Enforcers puts players in the role of a police officer navigating high-stakes crime scenes, where the goal was to shoot down armed criminals while avoiding innocent bystanders. What made it particularly controversial was its realistic portrayal of modern-day law enforcement and the stark imagery of shooting human targets, a subject that sparked debates about whether such content was appropriate, especially on a console largely seen as family-friendly. The ability to use the Super Scope, or the just-released Justifier light gun accessory, further intensified criticism, as some felt that mimicking the action of aiming and shooting made the game more visceral and unsettling, potentially glorifying the use of firearms. The controversy also extended to the game's perceived influence on younger audiences. The early 1990s was a period when debates about the impact of violent video games were reaching new heights, and Lethal Enforcers became part of this larger conversation. Parents and advocacy groups expressed concern that the realistic graphics, digitized human targets, and the simulation of law enforcement shootouts could desensitize players to violence. Moreover, critics argued that the game's emphasis on shoot-first gameplay blurred the line between entertainment and real-life issues around policing and use of force. Although Lethal Enforcers attracted a following among those who enjoyed arcade-style shooters, its controversies contributed to growing calls for stricter content ratings in video games, making it a key title in the debate over violence in gaming during the Super Nintendo era. Kid Klown and Crazy Chase, released for the Super Nintendo in 1994, was an unexpected source of controversy, primarily due to its portrayal of cartoonish violence and the somewhat unsettling depiction of its protagonist's repeated misfortunes. The game follows Kid Klown as he desperately tries to disarm a bomb before it goes off, all while navigating a chaotic world filled with traps and hazards that frequently send him sprawling. The slapstick nature of the game, featuring exaggerated pratfalls, explosions, and injury, prompting concern among some parents who felt that the constant depiction of a character being hurt for comedic effect sent a problematic message to younger audiences. While cartoons have long used slapstick as a source of humor, the repetitive nature of the mishaps in Kid Klown seemed to cross a line for those who felt it might normalize dangerous situations and desensitize children to pain. Further adding to the controversy was the portrayal of Kid Klown's desperation throughout the game, which included constant expressions of fear and distress. This sense of urgency and panic, while adding a unique level of tension to the gameplay, was unsettling to some players and parents alike. Unlike other platformers at the time, which often depicted brave heroes tackling their challenges head-on, Kid Klown instead emphasized a sense of vulnerability and helplessness as the character barely escaped peril after peril. Some critics argued that the game's frantic tone and relentless pace, paired with its visual gags centered on Kid Klown's constant suffering, made it emotionally stressful rather than enjoyable for its intended younger audience. Despite this, Kid Klown and Crazy Chase developed a niche following that appreciated its unconventional take on the platform genre, quirky humor, and challenging gameplay. Out of This World, or also known as Another World, was released for the Super Nintendo in 1992 and quickly became a source of controversy due to its mature themes, unsettling atmosphere, and the high level of difficulty. Unlike most games of its time, Out of This World took a cinematic approach to storytelling, presenting players with an alien world full of dangers, where the protagonist, Lester, is frequently subjected to violent and often graphic deaths. These deaths were depicted in a raw, unfiltered way that shocked many players, with Lester meeting grisly fates such as drowning, being impaled, or torn apart by alien creatures. The game's stark portrayal of vulnerability and death in a hostile environment was a significant departure from the more sanitized presentation of action and adventure that was typical on the Super Nintendo, making some parents uncomfortable with its graphic realism. Another point of controversy was the game's dark and often unsettling tone. which stood in contrast to the more vibrant and cheerful games that defined the platform. A lonely atmosphere complete with minimal dialogue and a haunting soundtrack conveyed an overwhelming sense of isolation and hopelessness as Lester navigates a world where almost everything is trying to kill him. This created a uniquely intense experience that was praised by some for its artistic vision, but criticized by others for being too bleak and emotionally taxing for younger players. The combination of sophisticated storytelling, mature themes, and challenging gameplay pushed the boundaries of what was expected from a Super Nintendo title, leading to debates about whether games like Out of This World were suitable for a console still largely marketed to children and families. Despite these controversies, the game remains a cult classic, celebrated for its pioneering cinematic storytelling and its influence on later generations of narrative-driven games. Super Star Wars, released for the Super Nintendo in 1992, sparked controversy due to its punishing difficulty and the liberties it took with the iconic Star Wars storyline. The game, based on Star Wars A New Hope, was known for its challenging gameplay with relentless enemies and unforgiving platforming sections. Many players, especially younger ones, found it excessively hard to progress without losing numerous lives, leading to frustration. The game's difficulty was seen by some as a barrier to entry, making it less accessible to casual players and those who simply wanted to experience the Star Wars universe in video game form. This difficulty was not entirely uncommon for games of the era, but in the context of Star Wars, a franchise beloved by audiences of all ages, many felt that it should have been more approachable to match the expectations of its diverse fanbase. Another point of contention was how the game altered some key plot elements and introduced action sequences not present in the original film. To create a more exciting and varied gameplay experience, the developers added numerous enemies, elaborate platforming sections, and vehicles that were not part of the original A New Hope storyline. For purists and devoted Star Wars fans, these deviations felt unnecessary and detracted from the authentic feel of the movie. Instead of focusing on the character development and the emotional weight of the narrative, the game often opted for frenetic action, which some felt overshadowed the story elements. Despite these controversies, Super Star Wars was well received by many for its impressive graphics, engaging action, and faithful recreation of the atmosphere of the film, making it both a beloved classic and a divisive experience for fans of the Star Wars franchise. The Lawnmower Man, released for the Super Nintendo in 1993, became a controversial title due to its heavy reliance on virtual reality themes and the mature content adapted from the film it was based on. The game was an adaptation of the sci-fi thriller film of the same name, which itself was inspired by a Stephen King story. The film's mature themes of mind control, experimentation, and the potential dangers of technology were carried over into the game, making it feel surprisingly dark for a Super Nintendo release. The game featured sequences where players experienced the virtual reality segments, which were designed to simulate a digital world. For many parents, the intense visuals and the overarching theme of losing control to technology were unsettling, especially for a console marketed to a younger audience. The complex storyline, touching on themes of unethical experimentation and psychological manipulation, stood in stark contrast to the more straightforward, family-friendly titles on the system. Adding to the controversy was the gameplay itself, which mixed standard platforming levels with first-person virtual reality sequences that were quite disorienting. These VR-inspired sections, with their digitized graphics and abstract environments, were unlike anything seen on the Super Nintendo at the time. They were intended to capture the futuristic feel of the movie, but instead left many players feeling overwhelmed or even confused. Critics argued that these sequences, combined with the dark narrative, made the game a strange fit for the Super Nintendo, which had cultivated a reputation for its accessible, colorful, and fun experiences. The Lawnmower Man's darker tone, coupled with its disorienting gameplay and mature themes, made it a polarizing title that raised questions about how far games could push the envelope on a platform associated with more family-oriented entertainment. Despite this, it found a niche audience intrigued by its experimental take on virtual reality and its ambitious, albeit unsettling, adaptation of the film. Mortal Kombat on the Super Nintendo released in 1993 and became one of the most infamous games of its time due to its intense violence and iconic fatalities. The original arcade version had already caused an uproar for its use of digitized actors and over-the-top graphic violence, but the controversy deepened with its transition to home consoles, especially when it came to Nintendo's approach to censorship. Unlike the Sega Genesis version, which featured a cheat code to enable the game's signature blood and gore, the Super Nintendo version replaced the red blood with gray sweat and significantly toned down the brutal finishing moves. This decision was made in line with Nintendo's family-friendly image, but it sparked a backlash among fans of the arcade original, who felt that the toned-down version was an inferior product. The lack of gore led to widespread criticism that the Super Nintendo version didn't live up to the expectations of the original experience, causing many players to flock to the Genesis version instead. Despite the censorship, Mortal Kombat on the Super Nintendo remained controversial for its inherent themes of violence and death. Even with the graphical changes, the core of the game still revolved around martial arts combat and the goal of overpowering an opponent, often ending with a dramatic finishing move. Many parents and advocacy groups at the time were alarmed by the game's premise, fearing it would desensitize children to violence. The controversy surrounding Mortal Kombat on both the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis became a significant catalyst in the push for a formal video game rating system, ultimately leading to the creation of the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, the ESRB. The debates around Mortal Kombat highlighted the growing divide between gamers seeking authentic, unfiltered experiences and the broader concerns about protecting younger audiences from mature content. Nintendo's approach to censoring the game ended up being a pivotal moment in gaming history, underscoring the challenges of balancing creative freedom with social responsibility. Wolfenstein 3D on the Super Nintendo was one of the most controversial titles of its time, primarily due to its overt depictions of Nazi imagery and violence, as well as the significant changes it underwent during the porting process. Originally released on the PC in 1992, Wolfenstein 3D was one of the first games to popularize the first-person shooter genre, but it was also notorious for its graphic violence and its setting within Nazi Germany, complete with swastikas, SS officers, and even a showdown with Adolf Hitler. When the game was adapted for the Super Nintendo in 1994, Nintendo made drastic changes to comply with their family-friendly guidelines. All swastikas and references to the Third Reich were removed, and the German Shepherd guard dogs were replaced by giant mutant rats, making the game somewhat surreal in comparison to its original version. These changes were intended to soften the game's imagery and avoid glorifying any historical hate symbols, but it sparked debate among fans and critics who felt that the alterations undermined the authenticity of the game's historical context. In addition to the censorship of Nazi symbols, the Super Nintendo version of Wolfenstein 3D faced criticism for the heavy reduction of blood and gore. The original game was known for its gritty realism, featuring pixelated pools of blood, injured enemies, and the brutal depiction of warfare. Nintendo, determined to uphold their family-friendly image, removed all visible blood from the game and instead used creative workarounds to lessen the violent impact. Despite these changes, the core of Wolfenstein 3D remained focused on gunning down enemies, which drew concern from parents and advocacy groups who argued that even a toned-down version of the game was inappropriate for a console that appealed to children. The controversy surrounding the Super Nintendo port highlighted the struggles of adapting mature games for a broader audience, and the compromises made raised questions about creative integrity and how far companies will go to sanitize content for younger players. Nevertheless, Wolfenstein 3D maintained its legacy as an iconic and pioneering first-person shooter, albeit in a version that was a shadow of the original's brutal and historically charged vision. Doom for the Super Nintendo released in 1995 and was undeniably controversial primarily because of its intense violence, demonic imagery, and the overall dark tone. Originally developed for the PC in 1993, Doom quickly gained a reputation for pushing the limit of acceptable content in gaming, featuring graphic depictions of blood and guts, satanic symbols, and relentless demon slaying. When the game made its way to the Super Nintendo, it brought much of that controversial content along with it, shocking a wider console audience that wasn't accustomed to such levels of violence. The imageries of pentagrams, hellish landscapes, and the slaughter of grotesque monsters raised alarm among parents and advocacy groups who worried about the game's impact on younger players. The moral panic around Doom was part of a broader cultural concern at the time regarding violent video games and their potential influence on impressionable audiences. Additionally, the technical limitations of the Super Nintendo hardware led to a version of Doom that many found frustrating and visually unappealing, adding to the fuel of the controversy. While the Super Nintendo port was an impressive technical achievement, considering it brought a demanding PC game to the 16-bit console, it came at the cost of significant compromises. The graphics were heavily pixelated, the frame rate was low, and the gameplay felt more sluggish compared to the original. Despite these limitations, Doom retained its core themes of graphic violence and horror, which prompted debate about whether it was appropriate for the Super Nintendo platform, which had largely been known for its family-friendly content. The combination of unsettling imagery, aggressive action, and the lingering concerns about the game's performance led to a mixed reception. While some players appreciated the chance to play such an iconic game on their favorite console, others felt it was an ill fit for the Super Nintendo's audience, pushing boundaries that many believed should remain untouched in a system popular with younger players. Pocky Rocky, released in 1993, was an adaptation of the Japanese game Kiki Kai Kai, a game deeply rooted in Shinto mythology. The game stars Pocky, a shrine maiden, and Rocky, her Tanuki friend, as they combat various yokai in a cheerful yet action-packed adventure. However, the transition from its native Japanese setting to the Western market wasn't without its cultural bumps. The controversy surrounding Pocky Rocky mainly revolved around the game's localization process, which involved more than just a language translation. To make the game more accessible to Western audiences, developers often had to simplify or alter cultural references, sometimes at the expense of the game's original depth. For instance, the portrayal of Rocky the Tanuki was a focal point. In Japanese folklore, Tanuki are multifaceted creatures, embodying trickery, prosperity, and even having the ability to shapeshift. But in Pocky Rocky, Rocky was depicted as a more straightforward, less nuanced manner, focusing on his cuteness rather than his mythological significance. This simplification was critiqued for potentially reducing the rich tapestry of Shinto folklore to mere aesthetics, leading to discussions on cultural representation in video games. Critics and players argued that while the game aimed to entertain, it also had the responsibility to respect and convey cultural context from which it was born. These conversations reflected the growing pains of the gaming industry in the 90s, as it sought to balance cultural authenticity with commercial appeal on a global scale. Breath of Fire 2. While cherished by many, it wasn't without its share of controversy, primarily due to its content adjustments post-release. Originally launched in Japan in 1994, the game was developed by Capcom and presented a world rich with fantasy elements. However, when the game was prepared for the North American audience, it faced some significant alterations. One of the most notable changes was the removal or alteration of a subplot involving religious themes, where a character named Father Gannett was involved in a scheme to brainwash children. This was considered too sensitive or controversial for Western audiences at the time, leading to the plot being either cut or heavily modified. The controversy extended beyond the storyline censorship. Another aspect was the game's use of a quote-unquote dream mechanic. where the protagonist, Ryu, could enter people's dreams to uncover hidden truths. One such dream sequence involved a character experiencing what could be interpreted as sexual abuse, which was deemed inappropriate for a game intended for younger audiences. This, along with character designs and dialogues that were seen as potentially offensive or too mature, led Capcom to make several adjustments in the localization process. These changes sparked debates within the gaming community about censorship in video games, the ethics of altering content to fit cultural norms, and the impact of such changes on the original narrative and player experience. The case of Breath of Fire 2 serves as a notable example of the complexities involved in game localization, where the desire to protect sensibilities can clash with artistic integrity and narrative depth. Chester Cheetah, Too Cool to Fool, released for the Super Nintendo in 1992, and found itself at the center of controversy primarily because of its promotional tactics and the character it featured. Developed as a tie-in to promote Frito-Lay's Cheetos brand, the game was criticized for its blatant use of product placement at a time when in-game advertising was not as common or accepted. Chester Cheetah, the anthropomorphic mascot, famous for his cool demeanor and love of Cheetos, was essentially the game's protagonist, leading players through levels to collect Cheetos, which served as a health meter. This approach was seen by many as an aggressive marketing strategy targeting children, leveraging the popularity of video games to push a product. Moreover, the controversy was compounded by the game's quality and perceived lack of effort in its development. Gamers and critics alike slammed the game for its repetitive gameplay, poor level design, and overall lack of innovation or depth, which felt like it was designed more to advertise Cheetos than to provide an engaging gaming experience. This led to discussions about the ethics of using video games as product promotion, especially when aimed at children. The game became a case study in how far companies would go to market their products through interactive media, sparking debates on consumerism in gaming, the impact of corporate influence on game design, and the question of whether such games exploit young gamers' vulnerability to advertising. Drakkhen, released for the Super Nintendo in 1991, stands out in the annals of gaming history, not just for its innovative approach to the RPG genre, but also for the controversies it stirred among players and critics. Developed by Infogrames, this game introduced an open world where exploration was a key component, but it was the game's design choices and difficulty level that became points of contention. Players were thrust into a world with minimal guidance, requiring them to learn through exploration, and often through trial and error. This lack of hand-holding was seen by some as a refreshing challenge, while others found it frustratingly opaque, leading to discussions about the balance between difficulty and player engagement in video games. Another aspect of Drakkhen that sparked controversy was its combat system and character progression. Unlike many RPGs of its time, Drakkhen featured a real-time battle system where positioning and timing were crucial, rather than the turn-based mechanics prevalent in most RPGs. This system, along with the game's character leveling, which was not as straightforward as players expected, was divisive. Some players appreciated the strategic depth it added, while others felt cheated or confused by the lack of clear progression and the high difficulty curve. Furthermore, the game's translation from French to English was criticized for being poor, often leaving players puzzled by the game's narrative and interactions, which added to the game's notoriety. Drakkhen thus became a talking point about the expectations of game design, the importance of user interface and player experience, and the cultural and linguistic challenges in localizing games for different markets.
Attention, all Earthbound gamers. Ness is in trouble. He needs your help to defeat Gigagas, and in order to do this, he's going to need his trusty bat and a couple of burgers. To help him, all he needs is your credit card number, the expiration month and year, and the 3 digits on the back. But you have to be fast, though, before Gigagas finishes his plan to take over O-Net.
Earthbound, known as Mother 2 in Japan, launched in 1995 with the Super Nintendo and became a subject of controversy that intertwined cultural differences, localization challenges, and marketing decisions, making it a unique case study in the gaming world. One of the most notable controversies was its initial reception in North America. Despite its innovative approach to the RPG genre with a modern setting, quirky humor, and relatable characters, Earthbound faced criticism for not adhering to the traditional fantasy RPG tropes that were popular at the time. Its offbeat humor, including references to American culture and the game's slower pacing compared to action-packed RPGs, led to mixed reviews. Priced at around $69.99 when the game came out, which, adjusted for inflation to $2024, would be approximately $144.80, which reflected its perceived value or perhaps the cost of its unique localization. The marketing strategy for Earthbound further fueled discussions. Nintendo of America decided to significantly alter the game's content to make it more suitable for Western audiences. This included changing names, altering certain dialogues, and even removing or modifying cultural references that might not translate well. Alongside the game, Nintendo of America released a player's guide, which was not just supplementary, it was essential for players to fully understand the game's mechanics, locations, and secrets, leading to outcry over the cost of entry for what was already an expensive game. To add an even more unique twist, the guide came with scratch and sniff cards, each corresponding to smells associated with different in-game locations, like the fresh scent of a forest or the stinky odor of a swamp. While this was an innovative promotional idea, it was also seen by some as gimmicky, contributing to the game's controversial reception regarding its value for money and the necessity of buying a guide to enjoy the game fully. Final Fantasy VI, or Final Fantasy III in North America, stands as one of the most beloved entries in the Final Fantasy series. Yet it wasn't without its share of controversy, particularly in how it was initially presented to Western audiences. One of the major points of contention was the drastic localization changes made by Square to adapt the game for North American players. This included altering character names, simplifying the script significantly, removing references to religion, and even censoring certain dialogues to adhere to cultural sensitivities. For example, the character of Celeste, originally a former general of an empire, had her backstory and some of her abilities changed or omitted, which some fans felt diminished her complexity and the game's thematic depth. These alterations led to discussions about cultural adaptation versus maintaining the integrity to the original narrative. Moreover, Final Fantasy VI sparked controversy due to its ambitious scope and narrative themes, which were quite mature for the time, especially in the gaming industry. The game tackled themes like tyranny, redemption, and the human spirit, with a cast of characters each dealing with their own personal struggles, including issues of abandonment, mental health, and discrimination. The inclusion of such themes was groundbreaking but also raised eyebrows among some players and parents, who were accustomed to the more traditional, less introspective narratives of earlier RPGs. The game's darker tone, combined with the localization changes, created a divide in the fanbase, with some appreciating the depth and maturity, while others felt it strayed too far from the genre's expected escapism, or that the changes in the localization process compromised the story's integrity. This controversy underlined the ongoing debate within video games about content, localization, and the portrayal of complex, often adult themes in what was still largely considered a medium for younger audiences. Super Castlevania IV, released in 1991 for the Super Nintendo, and while it celebrated for its graphical advancements and gameplay enhancements over its predecessors, it didn't escape controversy, particularly in how it handled the series' traditional elements and its narrative approach. One of the primary points of contention was the significant changes to the game's story and characters. In an effort to make the game more accessible to Western audiences, Konami made several alterations, including the removal of religious imagery and themes that were more pronounced in earlier Castlevania games. This included changing the iconic cross whip to a morning star, which for some fans felt like a betrayal of the series' roots, diluting its gothic horror themes to fit a broader, perhaps less mature audience. Moreover, Super Castlevania IV stirred debate with its approach to gameplay mechanics. While the game was lauded for its fluid controls and the introduction of the 8-way whip movement, some of the traditional gameplay elements were simplified or removed. For instance, the sub-weapon system was altered, and the game's level design encouraged exploration less than previous entries, focusing more on linear progression. This shift was seen by some as a move toward making the game more straightforward, possibly at the expense of the series' challenging and exploratory nature. The controversy extended to the game's difficulty. It was perceived as considerably easier than its NES predecessors, leading to discussions about whether this was an evolution or a deviation from what made the Castlevania games challenging and rewarding. These changes sparked a debate on the game's design philosophy, the balance between accessibility and maintaining a series' core identity, and how developers adapt classic series for new platforms and audiences. Zombies Ate My Neighbors, launched in 1993 for the Super Nintendo, that mixed horror with humor. Yet it found itself amidst controversy primarily due to its content and the marketing strategies employed. The game featured a diverse array of enemies, ranging from the titular zombies to aliens, mummies, and even giant babies, set against suburban backdrops. However, what drew significant attention was the game's use of violence, albeit in a cartoony, exaggerated form. The idea of kids mowing down hordes of monsters with an arsenal of comic weapons like squirt guns and weed whackers was seen by some as potentially desensitizing or even glorifying violence. This led to discussions on the impact of video game violence on younger players, especially at a time when such debates were becoming more prevalent in media and society. Adding to the controversy was the game's packaging and promotional material. The cover art depicted a scene of apparent chaos with children facing off against a horde of zombies, which some critics argue could be seen as promoting violence or fear among children. Moreover, the game included Easter eggs and humorous references that might have gone over the heads of younger players, but could be perceived as inappropriate by parents or adults. While the humor was intended to be lighthearted and satirical, it raised questions about the appropriateness of content in games marketed toward a younger audience. Despite these controversies, Zombies Ate My Neighbors has been recognized for its unique charm, blending horror with comedy in a way that, while controversial, contributed to its cult status among gamers. Cool World. The Super Nintendo game, released in 1992 to coincide with the film of the same name, quickly became embroiled in controversy for several reasons, reflecting broader issues around game adaptations, marketing, and content suitability. The game was licensed from the movie, which itself was controversial for its mix of live action and animation, and for themes some considered too adult for its target audience. The video game adaptation faced similar criticism, especially regarding its attempt to capture the essence of a film that dealt with mature themes like lust, identity, and the blurring lines between reality and fiction. Critics argued that the game, while toned down, still hinted at these adult themes through its narrative and character interactions, raising the question of whether such content was appropriate for the console's primary demographic of younger players. Moreover, the gameplay and overall quality of Cool World were points of contention. Players and reviewers noted that the game did not effectively translate the movie's unique visual style or its storyline into an engaging video game experience, resulting in a product that felt rushed or underdeveloped. The game's level design was criticized for being repetitive, and the controls were often described as clunky. This perceived a lack of effort or understanding in adapting the film's concept into gameplay led to discussions about the integrity of video game adaptations from other media at the time. It also highlighted the challenges developers faced in trying to balance the appeal of a known IP with the need to create a game that stood on its own merits. The controversy surrounding Cool World thus served as a case study in the complexities of game development, particularly in the context of movie tie-ins during the early 90s, where the push for quick market products sometimes overshadows quality and appropriateness. Illusion of Gaia, released for the Super Nintendo in 1994, was a game that not only offered a compelling narrative, but also stirred controversy due to its thematic depth and its approach to certain sensitive topics. Developed by Quintet, the game was praised for its unique blend of action RPG elements, with a story that explored philosophical and existential themes, including the meaning of life, death, and the essence of humanity. However, this narrative ambition led to controversy, especially with its handling of real-world historical events like the Holocaust. In one of its later stages, the game featured a town reminiscent of a concentration camp. While not explicitly detailed, was enough to spark debate about the appropriateness of including such dark historical references in a video game, particularly one that could be played by children. This led to discussions on whether video games should delve into such heavy topics or if they are better suited to lighter, escapist entertainment. Another dimension of controversy surrounding Illusion of Gaia was its exploration of religious themes. The game included scenes that could be interpreted as questioning or critiquing religion, particularly through the protagonist's interaction with various statues representing different world religions. This was seen by some as potentially offensive or provocative given the sensitive nature of religious beliefs. Critics and players debated whether such narrative elements were a bold artistic choice or an overstep in a medium still finding its footing in addressing complex societal issues. The game's approach to these themes highlighted the evolving role of video games as a narrative medium capable of sparking discussions on existential, historical, and philosophical questions. Yet it also underscored the challenges developers face when attempting to incorporate mature themes into games, especially considering the broad audience range of console gaming in the 90s. Mohawk and Headphone Jack, released for the Super Nintendo in 1996, and was a game that, despite its intended lightheartedness as a puzzle platformer, found itself at the center of controversy, primarily due to its character design and marketing. The game's characters, Mohawk and Headphone Jack, were two DJs on a mission to save their radio station from a rival. However, the character of Headphone Jack, with his headphones and notably large, bulbous head, was criticized for promoting negative stereotypes about mental health or physical appearance. This led to discussions about character design in video games and how they might inadvertently perpetuate harmful stereotypes or aesthetic norms, especially in a game aimed at younger audiences. The game, while minor in the grand scheme of the Super Nintendo's library, became a case study on the impacts of character design and marketing strategies in video gaming, highlighting the complexities of player engagement and representation. Bram Stoker's Dracula for the Super Nintendo released in 1993 and was a game adaptation of the Francis Ford Coppola film from 1992, bringing the vampire tale to the gaming world. However, its controversy wasn't rooted in the game's adaptation of the film's narrative or gameplay mechanics, but rather in its marketing and how it was perceived by audiences. Critics and fans debated whether this was a form of exploitation, leveraging the fame of a Hollywood film to sell a game that might not stand on its own merits. Moreover, the game itself was criticized for its content, particularly its depiction of violence and horror themes. While video games featuring horror elements were not new, Bram Stoker's Dracula was seen by some as pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable for a game on the Super Nintendo, a console known for its family-friendly titles. The game included scenes with blood and portrayal of Dracula that was darker and more violent than typical for the platform's games at the time. This sparked debates on the appropriateness of such content in games accessible to younger audiences, the responsibility of developers in portraying mature themes, and how far the industry should go in adapting cinematic horror for interactive media. Although Bram Stoker's Dracula was not alone in facing these issues, its association with the high-profile film adaptation brought these controversies into sharper focus within the gaming community and beyond. Choplifter III for the Super Nintendo released in 1994 and was a game that drew significant controversy due to its use of real-life conflict imagery and sensitive geopolitical themes. While the original Choplifter game had players rescuing hostages, a fairly universal theme, Choplifter III took a more direct approach by setting its missions in environments that closely mimicked real-world war zones, particularly those resembling the Middle East. This aspect became contentious as the game was released during a time when the region was experiencing actual conflict, leading critics to argue that the game potentially trivialized or exploited real human tragedies for entertainment. The use of stereotypes and the simplistic portrayal of these conflicts further fueled the debate on the ethics of using such themes in video games, especially without offering any educational or nuanced perspective on the issues. Moreover, Choplifter III was criticized for its portrayal of violence. The game allowed players to engage in combat with enemy forces, which combined with the setting, was seen by some as promoting a militaristic view or desensitizing players to violence in conflict zones. This was particularly sensitive given the political climate of the era. With ongoing discussions about the portrayal of war in media, especially in entertainment aimed or accessible by younger audiences, the controversy extended to how video games handle real-world issues, the moral responsibility of game developers, and whether games should attempt to simulate or comment on real-life conflicts. This discussion was emblematic of border conversations in the 90s about the role of video games in society, their potential impact on perceptions of violence, and the line between simulation for entertainment and the representation of real-world events. Hagane, The Final Conflict, released for the Super Nintendo in 1995 and was plunged into controversy largely due to its intense level of violence and graphical depiction of bloodshed, which was quite surprising for a game on a console typically associated with family-friendly titles. Developed by CAP Production, the game featured a ninja protagonist, Hagane, who utilizes various weapons to slice through his enemies, resulting in copious amounts of blood and gore. This was at a time when the video game industry was under scrutiny for content, especially violence, leading to debates about what was considered appropriate for the Super Nintendo. Critics and parents alike were divided. Some saw it as an unnecessary escalation of violence in video games, especially on a platform where more colorful, less violent games were the norm, while others appreciated the game's attempt to push the boundaries with its mature themes. The controversy was further amplified by the game's marketing and the cultural context at the time. The cover art and promotional materials emphasized the game's violent element, which some felt misrepresented or overstated the game's content to appeal to an older audience. This marketing approach led to discussions about the targeting of video game content and how it was advertised, especially considering the Super Nintendo's broad demographic reach. Hagane, The Final Conflict became a focal point for discussions on game ratings, the need for content warnings, and the broader debate about violence in video games. It highlighted the tension between creative freedom for developers and the responsibility toward their audience, particularly when the game's content significantly deviates from the expanded norms of its platform. The Adventures of Dr. Franken, released for the Super Nintendo in 1993, and brought a unique blend of platforming and puzzle solving to the console, but found itself in the eye of controversy mainly due to its thematic content and character portrayal. The game's protagonist, Dr. Franken, is a mad scientist who resurrects his beloved by piecing together various body parts, a direct homage to the Frankenstein story, but with a comedic twist. However, this premise led to discussions about the appropriateness of using such dark themes in a game designed for a younger audience. Critics pointed out that while the game attempted humor, the underlying concept of death, reanimation, and body horror might be too macabre for children, sparking a debate on the sensitivity of game content and the line between dark humor and potentially disturbing themes. Moreover, the game included elements that were seen as potentially offensive or in poor taste. One of the notable controversies was the inclusion of a character named Frankie, Dr. Franken's love interest, who is depicted as a stereotypical damsel in distress. This portrayal, along with the game's overall aesthetic of slapstick violence and the grotesque nature of the enemies, which included zombie-like creatures, led to criticism regarding how violence and gender roles were represented. The game's attempted humor often walked a fine line, with some players and critics arguing that it crossed into insensitivity or trivialized serious themes. The Adventures of Dr. Franken thus became an example in discussions about video game content, exploring how far games could go in their storytelling and character design before they were deemed inappropriate or in need of a more nuanced handling.
And now, this message.
Before we continue, I'd love to hear what you think so far. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm always interested in your feedback. If you're enjoying the video, don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel more than you know. And while you're at it, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any future videos. Alright, let's get back to the list. The Lion King, released for the Super Nintendo in 1994, and while a beloved adaptation of the iconic Disney film, it found itself amidst controversy, albeit in a more nuanced manner compared to games with explicit content issues. One of the primary points of contention was the game's difficulty level, which was intentionally designed to be extremely challenging due to strategic decisions related to the video game rental market of the era. According to insights from its development team, Disney directed the developers at Westwood Studios to make the game difficult enough that players, particularly children, would not be able to complete it during a typical rental period. This was done to encourage players to purchase the game instead of just renting it. This strategy was common during the 90s when video game rentals were at their peak, and publishers sought ways to boost sales by making games hard to beat in a short rental time frame. This decision, while business-driven, contributed to the game's notoriety for its difficulty, especially in levels like the Can't Wait to Be King sequence, where players needed precise timing and sometimes counterintuitive moves to progress, often leading to frustration. Players expecting a straightforward platformer based on the movie were met with challenging levels. This led to widespread frustration among younger players, sparking discussions about the balance between game accessibility and challenge, especially when marketing targets a young audience. Some felt the game unfairly capitalized on the movie's popularity, leaving many children unable to enjoy an experience reflective of the film's narrative and tone. Another aspect of controversy was the game's development and quality control. There were reports that the game was rushed to meet the film's release window, leading to numerous bugs and glitches that affected gameplay. This was particularly evident in different console versions, where the Super Nintendo edition was seen as more challenging and less polished compared to others. The discrepancies in quality and the aggressive marketing based on the Disney brand's family-friendly image led to a divide among fans and critics. Some argued that the game's issues highlighted a broader problem in game development at the time, where the pressure to capitalize on movie tie-ins could lead to compromised quality, raising questions about ethical marketing practices and the responsibility of developers to ensure a product meets the expectations set by its branding. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, released in 1992 for the Super Nintendo, was an attempt by Square to make the complex RPG genre more accessible to Western audiences, particularly those in North America, where RPGs hadn't yet captured the same market share as in Japan. However, this game became controversial among fans and critics for several reasons. Primarily, it was accused of oversimplifying the RPG mechanics that made the Final Fantasy series famous. Features like straightforward combat without random encounters, a visible overworld and dungeon map, and the ability to save anywhere were all designed for ease of play, but were seen by many as diluting the series' depth and challenge. This led to a significant divide between those who appreciated the game for making RPGs more approachable and those who felt it betrayed the spirit of what made Final Fantasy special. The controversy extended beyond gameplay mechanics into the realm of cultural adaptation. Mystic Quest was tailored with the American market in mind, featuring characters and stories that were perceived to be less nuanced than their Japanese counterparts. Critics argue that this localization not only simplified gameplay, but also the narrative and character development, which were hallmarks of the Final Fantasy series. Additionally, the game's music, while still composed by the legendary Nobuo Uematsu, was rearranged in a way that some fans felt did not capture the emotional depth of his original compositions. This game thus became a focal point for discussions about localization practices in video games, questioning whether making a game more accessible should come at the expense of its identity, or if there was a balance to be struck between accessibility and maintaining a game's core elements. Yoshi's Safari, released in 1993 for the Super Nintendo, was unique not only for its gameplay, but also for its use of the Super Scope light gun peripheral, which was already a contentious piece of hardware due to its bulkiness and the mixed reception of light gun games. However, the game stirred controversy for other reasons as well. One of the primary points of contention was its portrayal of violence, particularly because it featured the beloved Mario and Yoshi characters in a game where they actively shoot at enemies. This was seen by some as a departure from the typically non-violent nature of Mario games, leading to debates about the appropriateness of placing family-friendly characters in scenarios involving guns, especially when marketed toward children. Critics argued that this could be a step too far in mixing the innocence of Mario's universe with the direct violence of shooting games. Additionally, Yoshi's Safari faced scrutiny for its connection to real-world violence. At the time, the discussion around video game violence was heating up, with games increasingly being blamed for real-life violent behavior. Yoshi's Safari inadvertently became part of this larger conversation, especially since it utilized a light gun, which symbolically linked it to firearms. The game's inclusion in the Mario franchise was seen by some as an endorsement of gun use, even if in a fantastical context. Moreover, the game's requirement for the Super Scope added to its controversy, as the peripheral was not only expensive but also often criticized for its practicality, raising questions about inclusivity in gaming and whether the game was more of a gimmick to push hardware sales than a genuine addition to Mario's saga. The debate around Yoshi's Safari thus reflected broader cultural concerns about violence in video games, the impact of marketing characters in a new, potentially conflicting roles, and the ethical considerations of game design choices in the early 90s. Super Ghouls and Ghosts, released in 1991 for the Super Nintendo, and while celebrated for its graphical improvements and complex gameplay, was not without its controversies, especially concerning its difficulty level. Known for being one of the most punishing games on the platform, it required players to complete the game not once, but twice to achieve the true ending, with the second playthrough being even harder. This design choice led to widespread frustration among players, many of whom felt the game's high difficulty was more punitive than rewarding. Critics argued that this level of challenge was excessive, possibly alienating casual gamers and even some dedicated fans who found the game's demands on precision and pattern memorization to be overly harsh, sparking debates about game design, player skill expectation, and accessibility. Beyond its difficulty, Super Ghouls and Ghosts also stirred controversy with its content. The game featured a variety of grotesque enemies and environments, drawing from medieval European folklore and horror themes. While this was in line with the series' tradition, the explicit imagery of skeletons, zombies, and other undead creatures was seen by some as too dark or inappropriate for a console that was often played by children. This led to discussions on the appropriateness of horror themes in video games, especially how they might affect younger audiences. Super Ghouls and Ghosts thus became a focal point for debates on game difficulty, thematic content, and the balance between creative expression and broad appeal in the video game industry of the early 90s. Judge Dredd released for the Super Nintendo in 1995 and was based on the dystopian comic series and the subsequent movie, and found itself amidst controversy due to its content and how it was perceived by gamers and critics. The game's premise revolves around Judge Dredd, a law enforcer with the authority to act as judge, jury, and executioner, which itself raises ethical questions. However, the controversy intensified with the game's depiction of extreme violence. Players could witness and engage in violent acts, including executions, which was a significant departure from the Super Nintendo's usual fare. This led to criticisms about the game's suitability for younger audiences, with some arguing that it normalized or even glorified the use of lethal force by law enforcement, sparking a debate on the moral implications of video game content, especially in representation of justice and violence. Moreover, Judge Dredd was criticized for its quality in game design. Developed by Probe Entertainment, the game attempted to mix various gameplay styles, like shooting, driving, and platforming, but it was often described as clunky or poorly executed. This dissatisfaction was compounded by the game's marketing, which heavily capitalized on the Judge Dredd movie's release, leading to expectations that the game did not meet. The adaptation was seen as another example of a rush movie tie-in, where the focus was more on cashing in on the film's popularity rather than delivering a polished gaming experience. This sparked discussions about the ethics of game development practices, particularly the pressure to produce games quickly to coincide with movie releases, often resulting in games that felt underdeveloped or mismatched with their source material. The controversy around Judge Dredd highlighted issues of content appropriateness, the game's quality and movie tie-ins, and the challenges developers face in balancing fidelity to source material with the expectations of gamers. Final Fight, released for the Super Nintendo in 1991 and was an adaptation of the popular arcade beat-em-up, but it became controversial due to its content adjustments made for the console version. Originally, the arcade game featured two female characters, Poison and Roxy, who were part of the villainous gang. For the Super Nintendo, Nintendo of America mandated changes to adhere to their content guidelines, particularly regarding the depiction of women. In a move to avoid the implication of violence against women, both characters were replaced with male characters, Billy and Sid. This altercation sparked discussions about gender representation in video games, censorship, and the ethics of altering game content to fit regional standards. Critics and fans debated whether these changes were necessary or if they reflected a broader issue of how female characters were portrayed in gaming, often reducing their roles or changing their gender to sidestep controversy. Moreover, Final Fight on the Super Nintendo was also at the center of controversy due to its portrayal of violence. Despite the character changes, the game still featured intense street brawling, with players taking on numerous enemies, which some felt was too violent for the console's young audience. This led to discussions about the suitability of such games on home consoles, where the accessibility to children was much higher than in arcades. The game's design, which involved fighting through waves of enemies with moves like throws and punches, raised concerns about the glorification of street violence and its potential impact on players. Final Fight thus became a case study in the early 90s for examining the balance between preserving the essence of arcade experiences in home settings and ensuring content was appropriate for a broader, more diverse audience. Contra 3: The Alien Wars, released in 1992 for the Super Nintendo, and was a landmark title in the run-and-gun genre, but also faced its share of controversy, primarily due to its intensity of violence and thematic content. The game pushed the boundaries of what had previously been seen on the console, featuring graphic depictions of enemies being destroyed in various explosive and gory ways. While the original Contra series had gathered attention for its action-packed gameplay, Contra 3 escalated the violence with its vivid pixel art, showing detailed explosions, body parts flying, and even moments where enemies were burned or crushed. This level of graphic detail was unprecedented for the Super Nintendo, leading to discussions about the appropriateness of such content, especially on a platform often associated with family entertainment. Critics questioned whether the game's violence was too mature for younger players, sparking a broader debate on video game ratings and the portrayal of violence in games. Another layer of controversy with Contra 3 was its difficulty level, which was notorious even among seasoned gamers. The game demanded precision, quick reflexes, and pattern memorization, leading to frustration for many players who found it excessively challenging. This aspect was controversial because it seemed to cater to an elite group of gamers while potentially alienating those who wanted a more accessible experience. The game's design philosophy reflected a time when video games often had a steep learning curve, but Contra 3 took this to an extreme, leading to discussions about game design, accessibility versus elitism in gaming, and what constitute fair challenge versus punitive difficulty. The game's reputation for being hard, coupled with its violent content, made it a focal point for debates on how video games should evolve in terms of inclusivity and content suitability for various age groups. Spawn, released in 1995 and was adapted from the popular comic book series by Todd McFarlane, found itself mired in controversy due to its content and the challenges of bringing a mature-themed comic to a gaming platform known for its family-friendly image. The game attempted to capture the dark, gothic atmosphere of Spawn's universe, where he battles demonic forces and navigates a world of violence and moral ambiguity. However, the game's depiction of dark themes, including death, demons, and a protagonist who was once an assassin, raised eyebrows. Critics argued that the content, while toned down from the comic, still might be too intense or inappropriate for the Super Nintendo's usual audience. This led to discussions about the suitability of adapting complex, adult-oriented narratives into video games for consoles accessible to all ages, questioning the balance between staying true to the source material and ensuring content was appropriate. Moreover, Spawn faced scrutiny for its gameplay and development quality. Despite the anticipation surrounding the game due to McFarlane's involvement and the popularity of the comic, the game was criticized for various issues including repetitive gameplay, poor controls, and a perceived lack of polish. Some fans and reviewers felt that the game did not do justice to the rich narrative world of the Spawn comic, leading to disappointment among those who expected a deeper, more engaging experience. This scenario sparked a broader conversation in the pitfalls of video game adaptations from other media, particularly when the source material's tone and themes are significantly darker or more complex than typical video game fare. The controversy surrounding Spawn highlighted the challenges developers faced when adapting mature content for platformers with a broad demographic, as well as the expectations fans have for games based on beloved stories. Blackthorne, released in 1994, was an action-adventure game that, while innovative in its storytelling and gameplay, stirred controversy due to its mature themes and intense violence. Developed by Blizzard Entertainment under the name Silicon and Synapse, the game featured a dark, dystopian setting where the protagonist, Kyle Blackthorne, battles against an oppressive regime and grotesque creatures. The game's depiction of violence, including scenes where enemies are visibly injured or killed by gunfire, was seen as a stark departure for typical Super Nintendo fare. This led to debates about the appropriateness of such content on a console often played by children, with some arguing that the game's graphic nature might not align with Nintendo's family-friendly image. The controversy extended beyond its content to the game's marketing and reception. Blackthorne was part of an era where video games were starting to explore more adult themes, pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable on consoles. The game's use of early cinematic storytelling through pre-rendered cutscenes was praised, yet it also highlighted the challenges of delivering mature narratives on platforms traditionally associated with younger audiences. Additionally, the game's difficulty level and the shift from the more arcade-like action of contemporaries of a more methodical, survival-focused gameplay was divisive. Some players appreciated the depth and challenge, while others found it too punishing or not in line with the expectations set by other games of its time. Blackthorne thus became a focal point in discussions about the evolving nature of video games, integrations of mature themes, and the balance between maintaining games' artistic vision and catering to the sensibilities of a broad audience. Lemmings 2: The Tribes, released in 1993, brought about its own set of controversies, primarily due to its departure from the original game's simplicity and accessibility. The first Lemmings game was beloved for its straightforward mechanics and the challenge of guiding lemmings to safety with limited skill assignments. However, Lemmings 2 introduced over 50 new skills, which significantly increased the complexity of puzzles. While this was intended to deepen the gameplay experience and offer more variety, it alienated some fans who cherished the original for its simplicity. Critics and players debated whether this complexity was an evolution or a deviation from what made Lemmings special, with some feeling that the game had lost its core appeal by requiring players to remember and manage an overwhelming array of skills, thus making it less intuitive and more of a learning curve than a fun puzzle game. Moreover, Lemmings 2 was controversial for its perceived lack of innovation in other areas. Despite the addition of new skills, the game was criticized for not significantly evolving the core concept or gameplay loop from its predecessor. The visual and audio enhancements were noted, but the overall game design felt repetitive to some, with the puzzles often requiring the same basic strategies, just with different tools. This led to discussions about sequelitis in gaming, where follow-ups to a successful game failed to offer fresh content or meaningful improvements, instead relying on the franchise's name to sell. The controversy around Lemmings 2 highlighted the delicate balance developers must strike between maintaining the essence of a beloved game while attempting to expand and innovate, sparking a wider conversation about the expectations of sequels and the evolution of a game series in the video game industry. Demolition Man, released in 1995, brought the high-stakes action of the popular Sylvester Stallone and Wesley Snipes film to the console, but it didn't come without controversy. Based directly on the 1993 sci-fi action movie, the game closely mirrored the film's violent themes, showcasing intense shootouts, explosive action scenes, and gritty levels that pushed the boundaries of what was typically seen on the Super Nintendo. Due to its heavy violence, Demolition Man raised concern among parents and advocacy groups, especially with its on-screen blood effects and brutal gameplay, which were notable for a Super Nintendo title. The gritty realism combined with the violent imagery made it one of the more mature titles on the console, sparking discussions about the appropriateness of such content for younger audiences, especially given Nintendo's reputation for family-friendly gaming. Another point of contention was how the game handled the movie's darker satirical themes, like the dystopian critique of society and policing. While the film balances violence with satirical commentary on societal issues, the game focused solely on the action, losing much of the narrative depth. This left some fans of the movie feeling that the game didn't capture its more nuanced themes, while others criticized it for feeling just like another shooter than a meaningful adaptation of the source material. Additionally, Demolition Man was considered a hard game, with punishing difficulty spikes that added to the player's frustration. This combined with the graphic violence left a mixed legacy for the game. While some praised its faithful adaptation of the movie's action sequences, others felt it leaned too heavily on the violence without capturing the deeper message, making Demolition Man a polarizing title in the Super Nintendo library. Shaq-Fu, released in 1994, quickly became one of the most talked about and controversial games on the console, largely due to its unusual premise and gameplay issues. At its core, Shaq-Fu was a fighting game, starring none other than basketball legend Shaquille O'Neal as the main character, embarking on a journey through a mystical dimension to rescue a young boy named Nizu. The game's odd blend of celebrity endorsement and supernatural martial arts puzzled many players, leading to widespread criticism. Gamers and critics alike questioned the logic of pairing an NBA superstar with a mystical, story-driven fighting game, especially when Shaq was known for his on-court talents, not fighting abilities. This unusual crossover felt forced to many, causing Shaq-Fu to be seen more as a marketing gimmick than a serious entry in the fighting genre, drawing mockery and sparking intense debate about the role of celebrity influence in video games. Adding to the controversy was the game's technical performance and gameplay design, which many players found frustrating. The controls were often described as clunky and unresponsive, making it difficult for players to execute moves reliably. The character roster and moveset were limited, especially compared to other popular fighting games of the time, like Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat. Additionally, the levels felt repetitive, and the storyline was criticized for being shallow and nonsensical. This disconnect between the hype around Shaquille O'Neal's involvement and the underwhelming execution of the game led Shaq-Fu to be seen as a notorious example of style over substance. Over the years, it's gained a sort of cult status, often labeled as one of the worst games ever made, and its legacy remains divisive. For some, Shaq-Fu is an amusing artifact of 90s pop culture, while for others it represents a low point in the era's licensed gaming. Terranigma. Terranigma released in 1995 in Japan and Europe, but never officially in North America, and was a game that sparked controversy primarily due to its bold themes and philosophical undertones. Developed by Quintet, Terranigma tackled complex issues like the nature of life, death, and rebirth, as well as human progress and environmental destruction. Heavy themed for a game on a family-friendly console. In Terranigma, players journeyed through a dark mystical world, essentially tasked with resurrecting Earth and humanity itself. The storyline was filled with references to religion, creation myths, and moral ambiguity, prompting some concern over its appropriateness for younger players. At a time when most games were focused on simple gameplay mechanics, Terranigma took an intellectual and spiritual approach that, while critically acclaimed, was seen as risky and even provocative. Adding to the game's controversial reputation was its decision to depict the cycle of civilization in ways that could be seen as bleak or critical of humanity. In one section, players essentially recreate human society, only to witness cycles of war, corruption, and decline, a reflection on humanity that was startling in the context of a video game. The omission of a North American release by Nintendo often fueled discussions about censorship and regional content restrictions. Some speculated that Nintendo of America found the game's religious and existential themes too controversial for their market, preferring to avoid potential backlash from parents or advocacy groups. The game's lasting appeal among fans has only underscored how daring and unusual Terranigma was for its time, offering a thought-provoking experience that went far beyond traditional gameplay and challenging norms of what video game narratives could explore. Phantom 2040, released for the Super Nintendo in 1995 and was a game that stood out for its ambitious themes, complex storytelling, and the surprising level of violence portrayed for the era. Based on the animated series of the same name, Phantom 2040 featured a dystopian world where players, as Kit Walker, the latest line in masked vigilantes known as Phantom, fight against a sinister corporation bent on ecological destruction. The game explored themes of corporate corruption, environmental exploitation, and social collapse, which added an unexpectedly mature layer to its gameplay. Phantom 2040 was bold in tackling these darker themes, making some parents and critics uneasy. The game's storyline raised eyebrows as it mirrored real-world issues and portrayed a world on the brink of ecological disaster, which felt politically charged for a video game at the time. Adding to the controversy was the game's tone and visual style, which were darker and more intense than platformers or action games on the console. The graphics had a gritty, almost cyberpunk feel, and the Phantom used weapons and combat in a way that was aggressive and occasionally graphic, given the 16-bit limitations. While Phantom 2040 didn't feature the same blood and gore as other mature games, the thematic violence and dystopian visuals were enough to make it stand out, and make some parents uncomfortable. This was a period when video games were under scrutiny for their impact on younger players, so Phantom 2040's approach to social issues and use of violent themes generated significant debate. Some hailed it as an intelligent, mature title, while others saw it as a risky choice for younger audiences. Ultimately, the game pushed boundaries for what an action could cover on the Super Nintendo, making it a memorable and in some cases controversial addition to the console's library. Lagoon. Lagoon released for the Super Nintendo in 1991 and stirred up its share of controversy, primarily due to its gameplay mechanics and overall design, which many players found frustrating and outdated even at its time of release. Billed as an action RPG, Lagoon follows Nasir, a young hero tasked with stopping an ancient evil and purifying tainted water sources. While the premise has potential, Lagoon became infamous for its unusual combat system, where Nasir's sword was limited to an incredibly short range, making it feel more like a dagger. This odd mechanic left players vulnerable and frustrated, especially since Nasir often had to get dangerously close to enemies to land a hit. The game's combat difficulty, combined with its limited movement mechanics, left many fans of the RPG genre feeling disappointed, sparking criticism and making Lagoon a polarizing title. Just as a side note before we move on, I actually have a lot of fond memories with Lagoon, and I'm probably one of the few people who actually like it. If you'd like to know more about Lagoon, like its development or other interesting bits, I made a video covering Lagoon in my Forgotten Games series. I'll leave a card here if you'd like to check it out. Adding to the controversy was the general lack of polish in the game's graphics and storytelling, which felt outdated compared to other Super Nintendo RPGs at the time. The visuals were often seen as simplistic, with repetitive backgrounds and sparse detail, which paled in comparison next to games like A Link to the Past, which was released a few months later. Players also found the storyline somewhat thin and lacking depth, especially compared to other RPGs that were gaining popularity for their engaging narratives. Despite having a promising setup and atmospheric soundtrack, Lagoon's execution left much to be desired, leading to a divisive reputation among Super Nintendo fans. While some players appreciated its challenging nature, others viewed it as an underwhelming experience that didn't live up to the growing standards of the genre, cementing Lagoon as a title that stirred frustration and debate among fans. It looks like we've reached the end of the Super Nintendo era. I really enjoy making these videos, and I hope you'll stay tuned, because not only do I have more controversial games videos for different consoles in the Nintendo library, but I also want to start doing some video documentaries like my Forgotten Games series, which I mentioned in the Lagoon section. So since we're done with the Super Nintendo, we're going to move on to the Nintendo 64. And oh boy, there are some games on there that are going to be fun to talk about. But anyway, let me know what you think of the series so far, the games I have in these lists. Let me know anything you want down in the comments below. If you liked this video, please leave a like. If you didn't, that other button seems to work pretty well too. And if you're new here, please consider subscribing for a plethora of gaming-related videos, whether that be on controversial games, or forgotten games, or gaming in general. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.